can you quickly talk us through how the diagnosis of narcolepsy type 1 evolved?
Okay. Thanks for having me on, first off. So, as a child, I would experience these weird occasions. It was mainly during tickling battles and good fun with family, friends. And I would always lose because anytime I got tickled under the armpits, under the feet, side of the belly, I would just lose my ability to keep my arms up. I would have these distinct inner sensations just like rushing through my head, throughout my body. I could laugh, I could roll, I could try to tickle back, but my arms would just barely move. And through my teenage years, in hindsight, I can tell very much that there were psychological effects going on. All of those years, the only real physical instances I can think back to in my teenage years were during vertigo at high elevations, not like when your middle ear is, when you're sick and nauseous, but when you're at a high, on a fire tower or up in a skyscraper. I would have this like physical body freezing along with those inner distinct sensations. They're sensory experiences. But so at 20 years old, out of nowhere, I started during laughter at home around my parents or during moments of like them handing me a plate of food or smiling at the food I was cooking, saying it smelled good, being complimented, being just engaging in, humor and whatnot. I began stop being able to laugh. I was internally like laughing really hard, but my facial muscle control would melt. And that quickly became having to lean against the wall because I was like unstable. I was losing composure physically. And within weeks, I was ending up on the ground and fully unable to laugh. And like, so at first I battled that. And I had a few episodes where I was probably looked like I was having a seizure because I was fighting it so hard. My whole body was just like twitching. I would go down to the ground for 30 seconds, be fully paralyzed, get back up. Throughout this, I'm fully conscious. I can hear, I can see, my eyes are controllable. I'm sure they're like sputtering because it's rapid eye movement. So that was at 20 years old, and that began happening 5 to 20 times a week. And that
Wow.
was really rough.
So you started off as a kid, even maybe having these cataplexy symptoms when you think back at it, but it
Absolutely.
sounds like it really did not escalate until you were about 20. Okay. And then rapidly so.
Yeah, and like so it at 28 I finally found the term through Google searching laughter and paralysis, and there was an article about cataplexy and how it related to narcolepsy, and I was like, wow, that's fits like a glove, but the sleepiness, I don't have that. That seems
Oh,
weird.
interesting.
Though I, over the 2 to 3 year process of my diagnosis, which was really hard due to the apnea matter and the process, the MSLT, and just where I am in part. But over those years, I was reading online, reading medical literature, interacting with other people, and it became very clear to me that I have had every symptom my whole life. I just only know it as normal. And have always had headaches, migraines, like I missed about a day a week of school all through school and college. But it became clear that I was dealing with what sleepiness was more as like a ongoing fatigue, a cloud, the brain fog. It just never occurred to me that that was sleepiness. My friends, who, when I finally told them about the narcolepsy and described the cataplexy, because I could only describe it for all those years as a dissipation of my muscles during pleasant interactions, because it
Hmm.
really was more so pleasant. I learned, so like I gotta say, as an infant, I had hypoglycemic seizures, and that led to me taking part in an experimental surgery where they removed most of my pancreas at Mayo Clinic. So I grew up with compromised health, knowing I could either redevelop seizures or diabetes. And that sort of played into, I didn't really want to go in and try to explain it without a clear way of describing it because it could turn into get sidelined. I don't know. I just wasn't comfortable trying to do that because I had difficulties really getting like the migraines. I never really was able to figure out much help with the doctors. And I have a good GP, thankfully. And when I finally approached him and told him about it, he sent me to a neurologist. And then, like I said, it kind of went sideways for a few years. because I couldn't tolerate and benefit from the PAP therapy. So we never got to the MSLT.
I'm curious as to what ultimately happened and how you're being managed now. Like, so just to level set, when Saul is talking about MSLT, that is a study that we do. Typically, we have a PSG or polysomnogram. That's the overnight in lab sleep study. A lot of people know about sleeping overnight and having a bunch of wires on your head. And then we keep you for naps. So it's basically an extended polysomnogram. We're looking to see how sleepy you are. One of the requisite requirements for being able to pursue a diagnosis of a central disorder of hypersomnia like narcolepsy is we want to exclude other types of sleep disorders. But obviously, you actually do have other sleep disorders. And the specific one that's really tricky is the central apnea. So, how did that diagnosis come about? What led them to discover that? I'm assuming
So,
it was a polysomnogram and they discovered it
yep,
that
absolutely.
way.
I went in, the neurologist. So I had videos of my having severe complete cataplexy that I showed them. I told them, I think it's got to be cataplexy or some sort of cataplexy without narcolepsy, because I wasn't talking about sleepiness. So they did a sleep study with the MSLT scheduled, but during it, I had a AHI, apnea hourly index, of 11, and they considered it obstructive. So they put me on a BiPAP. A couple weeks later, I followed up and they set up another polysomnography and they put me on a BiPAP ST. About a month later, I went back in and they were like, this isn't working. So they put me on the VPAP ASV Adapt Swervo. And so I kept on that for another 8 months, I think. And they just weren't listening to me tell them about the cataplexy. And my cataplexy actually progressed to 5 to 25 times a day during about 3-4 months in. And it just kept being that bad. I was like not benefiting. And I have lots of allergy, middle ear. I've had a septoplasty. I mean, I've had a lot of ENT matters, and that made the PAP therapy really impossible. Or like I was struggling and struggling, but I kept trying. And I set up the appointment at Mayo Clinic to get a second opinion because I was getting nowhere, and it was like they wouldn't even talk about cataplexy. So yeah, it came about through all of that. When I went to Mayo Clinic, they agreed I was not benefiting from the PAP therapy. They did the polysomnography, and then they did an MSLT 10 days later with my wearing actigraphy over those 10 days, which led to the delayed sleep phase onset syndrome disorder as well. But the diagnosis, so I had a 9-minute mean sleep latency, which also makes my entire diagnosis a little bit on the fence. They called it probable type 1 narcolepsy with definitive cataplexy. As I went into the appointment with the sleep specialist, the follow-up at Mayo Clinic, he saw me walking in with my cup of coffee for the first time in 11 days because they had me off coffee for those 10 days. But he commented that I looked happy to have my coffee again. And I just I handed it to him immediately as I stumbled and went down to the ground because it triggered the cataplexy. But yeah, I mean, it was a roller coaster.